As much as we crap on the Senate for being full of corporate bought career politicians, there are apparently enough diamonds in the rough to make up at least 3 lists. And many more, because as I said, we're going to be going through a ton of them until we reach 100. This is going to be quite the endeavor. Now, I don't think I've actually gone over the rules for how these lists are going to work, and how this whole series is going to work, so I guess I might as well go over them now, and for future videos, I'll keep repeating these rules. First, we're mostly going to be ranking the senators based on who's on the list, rather than in general. Like, all the people on this list aren't necessarily worse than the people in my first 2 lists. And people in future lists are not inherently worse than people on this list. It's mostly just based on when I found out the senators existed and just how I feel they are put on the list. And yes, I've done my research and have found quite a number of people that could be in future lists, and it's basically up to me to figure out how they would line up. Next, after the 10 lists are done, and we got biographies of basically everybody in contention, we will then work our way back around and finally figure out how each of the people ranks amongst everyone else. And some smaller tidbits is that I tried to keep it exclusive to this branch. Like, we're gonna judge them based on their tenure in the Senate, even if they have a future job. Now, yes, there are some people who were in the Senate that get jobs higher than the Senate, and I've tried to keep them off contention thus far, but starting with list 4, I think that's going to be changing. And lastly, I'm trying to keep current senators off the list, and believe it or not, it's actually kind of easy, but I don't know when I'll have to inevitably start including some current guys in the field. And the last rule, this is my opinion. Like, I mean, I know there are a lot of you that probably are watching this that are going to say that some people on this list or previous lists or future lists stink, but that's just what you're getting. If you don't like, you can leave, or you can actually hear me out and figure out what I mean. We got the explanation out of the way. We're all good here? Great. So now let's get into 10 senators that I think were pretty great. Number 10, Margaret Chase Smith. Finally, a freaking woman makes it on the list. This was starting to become a huge sausage fest, to be honest. Margaret was always kind of othered throughout her entire political career. A woman being othered in a male-dominated job? Pfft, never thought I'd see the day. I mean, during her first run for Senate, one of her opponent's wives literally went around saying, "Can a woman really be a senator?" Margaret's response to her was getting more votes than all of her opponents combined. When she went to serve, she decided to become an even bigger target by calling out Joseph McCarthy in a speech called the Declaration of Conscience, saying that he turned the US Senate into a forum of hate and character assassination. He in turn called her and a couple of senators who aligned themselves with her in the speech Snow White and the Six Dwarves, and funded someone to primary her. She would later end up winning that challenge too. She was even mentioned as a potential vice presidential nominee to Dwight D. Eisenhower before deciding to try for the top spot herself. There really isn't much else for me to say except that she basically proved her campaign slogan right. Don't change a record for a promise. Number 9, Charles Goodell. I have pushed Goodell back 2 lists previously, but he's finally here. What made him worthy to be in the first list to begin with? Well, aside from the novelty of having Republicans on the list, because it would be interesting to see a socialist have Republicans in their top 10 favorite senators list, Goodell is actually really interesting, as originally, when he was in the House of Representatives, he was a moderate conservative, but after he was appointed to Bobby Kennedy's seat after his assassination, he took a drastic shift to the left. So much so that conservatives called him the Christine Jorgensen of the Republican Party, making reference to one of the first wildly publicized sex change operations. I'll have you take a wild guess what was the biggest difference between him and the conservative detractors. If you haven't pieced it together, it's obviously Vietnam. Goodell being one of the loudest anti-Vietnam War Republicans. In fact, he was such a loud voice against the Vietnam War that a lot of people in the New Left endorsed him when it was time for him to run for a full term. Coretta Scott King, Jane Fonda, Ben Spock, Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky backed this guy. A libertarian socialist backed a Republican for Senate. The analogy, while incredibly transphobic, is kind of on the ball. Unfortunately, he didn't stay around that long to make a difference. But hey, he wasn't bad for someone who only stayed in the Senate for a third of the time that you're supposed to. Number 8, Gaylord Nelson. Now that you're done laughing, let me tell you about his accomplishments. He was a huge environmental activist during his tenure, even being the creator of Earth Day. He was also a huge consumer advocate and fought hard for civil rights. He also led the Nelson pill hearings that made pharmaceutical companies have to disclose side effects of the pills that they were pushing. Yes, believe it or not, they didn't used to do that. And to sound like a broken record, he was an advocate against the war in Vietnam. He was also a huge advocate for small businesses and was one of 3 senators to vote against Ford for VP, which is kind of a mixed bag. You could really make the argument that really either way you vote on that, it didn't matter that much. I mean, to be honest, he is basically sort of in the Wisconsin standard of senators. I mean, I guess he's essentially just a more moderate version of Robert M. La Follette. Actually, fun fact, he was originally supposed to be in the last video, but I decided to swap him and Proxmire because Proxmire just, I guess, kind of edged out because, McCarthy. But Nelson isn't that bad either. Number 7, Terry Sanford. Yeah, you can tell North Carolina hasn't exactly sent their best, as I'm already reusing somebody from another list. But honestly, Terry kinda deserves it. While he self-admits that his Senate term was not as groundbreaking as his gubernatorial tenure, he definitely does edge out some of the competition in the Senate, especially when you consider the time period and what state he's from. He had a very basic, progressive, left-lib type voting record. 2 things stand out for me. 1, him being a leading opponent of the Gulf War, and 2, being the loudest voice against an amendment to ban flag burning by leading a counter-campaign of promoting the Bill of Rights. However, a lot of factors basically just made it so that it wasn't necessarily going to be. But his Senate career did do quite a number of things, one of which potentially be kickstarting the career of a future president. Number 6, George Norris. Norris was a very unique figure, even compared to other progressive Republicans at the time. While every other progressive Republican in 1912 was shouting, "Teddy, Teddy, Teddy," he was shouting, "Fighting Bob, Fighting Bob, Fighting Bob." While a leading Senate Republican, he pushed hard for the direct election of senators, was a staunch non-interventionist, and teamed up with Fiorello LaGuardia to pass the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which banned yellow dog contracts. After Roosevelt entered the scene, he decided to GOP exit and become an independent Bernie/Morse type of congressman. He showed his ability to work through any administration, even when they were opposing parties, and doing that to bring good change. In fact, him being on this list is actually a bit of a downgrade, because here's a little fact that you might not have known. Brief side tangent. If you know anything about popular senators, you might be aware of something called the Famous Five. Basically, in the late 50s, a bunch of senators got together and basically wanted to create a universal list of senators that were regarded as the greatest. So they went to a bunch of scholars to basically go over the histories and legislative accomplishments of all the senators up to that point and come to a consensus of 5 senators that they could claim were the best. The ones they ended up choosing were Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Robert Taft, and Robert M. La Follette Sr. And in 2004, Arthur Vandenberg and Robert Wagner were also included in the list, making it a famous 7. But originally, George Norris was universally picked to be the number 1 senator. But leader of the Senate Republicans, Styles Bridges, had a personal vendetta against Norris and forbade him from being included. Norris got notoriously screwed that day, but hopefully the number 6 spot in a third list does him justice. Number 5, Paul Simon. While this Simon didn't have a Garfunkel, he didn't really need one. Simon positioned himself as sort of the last leg of New Deal liberalism with the rising New Democratic neoliberal faction of the Democratic Party, being a very notable critic of Clinton's welfare reforms. Another contrast Simon had with Clinton was in regards to the Rwandan genocide, trying desperately to get Bill to talk to the UN into doing something. One of the last major contrasts that he had was in regards to the Defense of Marriage Act, Simon taking the not homophobic route. Simon even decided to not become a career politician and retire after 2 terms. Man, a guy who cares more about the policies and not his own personal ego? What? That's crazy. Well, okay, maybe he cared a little bit because he did end up running for president at one point. But clearly not enough to just stay around for 10,000 years, which is a problem we seem to be having in the Senate. Number 4, Paul Douglas. From one Illinois Paul to another, Douglas was a bit of an interesting figure, as to my knowledge, he may have been one of the only purely Georgist members of the U.S. Senate. I think there may have been Georgists in the House, and some senators might have been inspired by Georgism, but I think Paul was the only member of the Senate to point blank be like, I am a Georgist. For those who have no clue what Georgism is, I was going to make a video talking about it, but then Mr. Beat stole the video idea from me. I think he finally got his revenge for me ripping him off. But for a very brief summary, it is a broadly left libertarian ideology that has basically enough broadness to appeal to people from all across the political aisle, and it all revolves around the idea of there being one tax within the entirety of the United States, that being a progressive land value tax. Douglas very much exemplifying this as being both fiscally restrained but also a hardcore leftist, strongly supporting the fair deal and civil rights to the point where Martin Luther King Jr. called him the greatest of all senators. He fought well on environmental protection, public housing, and against redlining. While he was unable to do Georgism, his biggest piece of legislation was the Consumer Credit Protection Act, which streamlined the process of loans and such that wasn't even passed during his tenure. Interesting figure, but good nonetheless. Number 3, Claude Pepper. Claude Pepper actually went backwards. He went from the Senate to the House instead of the usual House to Senate pipeline. Claude was a hardcore New Dealer, placing him solidly in the Henry Wallace wing of the party. He took charge on many bills regarding labor rights, most prominently the Wage Hours Bill that would eventually become the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Another issue he fought for was the abolition of Florida's poll tax. Claude also took an interesting stance in regards to the USSR. Rather than being a hardline anti-communist, he actually sought to be in good relations with them. That, combined with him challenging/drafting a challenge to Truman, made him an easy target to be primaried by the political establishment, back at a time where you could actually do that and not face any pushback. As you know, he would later end up going to Congress, where he moderated a lot of his stances, but he still was good enough to make it into the top 50 there. Number 2, Russ Feingold. Feingold was another figure of the American progressive movement, taking up the mantle that Wellstone left behind and Bernie would hold afterwards. Russ positioned himself as one of the furthest left senators, at least in the modern era, and being quite the maverick even for his political position, voting against Dodd-Frank because he felt that it didn't go far enough. Speaking of financial issues, he was also a huge advocate for campaign finance reform, authoring the McCain-Feingold Act, but the biggest issue he had to tackle during his tenure as the liberal firebrand of the 2000s was, of course, in regards to the Bush administration. First, the Iraq War, not only opposing the war on day one, but also calling his own colleagues timid, and proposed a pullout date of December 31st, 2006. But his bigger, More notable opposition to the Bush administration was the fact that he was the sole U.S. senator to vote against the Patriot Act, being one of those many one-man stand votes that is actually very commendable. He was so notable for the time period that he was a senator that when he'd lost, and he was in a somewhat political retirement, when Bernie revitalized the progressive movement in 2016, Russ came back for one final hoorah, a thing lefties are very prominently known to do. Now you might be wondering, wait, this is number 2? Who's number 1 then? Well, number 1, Frank Church. Now, Church seems like one of those nobody senators that I would put near the bottom of a list. He doesn't really strike you as a number 1 choice. So what the heck could this guy have done to make him beat Russ Feingold? 2 things. 1, while many of the people who opposed Vietnam War were all talk, Church was the one who actually managed to bring the war closer to its end by passing the Case-Church Amendment, which literally said, if you want to continue the war, you have to get congressional approval, effectively ending the soft power that the US was exerting there. But most prevalently came from the fact that Church went toe-to-toe with the US intelligence agency and won. You see, during the 70s, small amounts of information were being released about the US intelligence agencies doing stuff that they were not supposed to be doing. So Church started a Senate committee to investigate the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA to basically find out how deep it went. He ended up revealing that they were spying on leftist groups with COINTELPRO. They had sent MLK a letter telling him to kill himself. They were collecting all telegraphic data coming into the US with Project Shamrock, and that many high-profile people, including Church himself, were being directly spied on by the US government via Project Minaret. And this committee was so high-profile that the intelligence agencies had to actually change how they were doing things. And the large trend of hating the government that was basically commonplace at the time was more solidified. I mean, look, you can't beat that. Like, this whole series is basically to get people to look further into senators that you might not know. And I encourage you, look more into Church. He's way more impressive than I'm even stating. So yeah, that's 10 more senators that have been compiled to the list. Let's wait and see if there are any more that could potentially beat these guys. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to notify that a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check out my articles in the Independent Political Report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.